Mr. Yang, your signature policy is to give every adult in the United States $1,000 a month, no questions asked.
That's right.
In the last Democratic presidential primaries, Andrew Yang burst onto the national scene on the back of one policy: universal basic income. But despite going from unknown commodity to the internet's favourite candidate pretty much overnight, Yang wasn't able to gain much traction electorally. He finished with just 1% of the vote in Iowa and only 2.8% of the vote in New Hampshire, the only two primaries he participated in. Yang's candidacy wasn't a failure though, because at the end of the day, his campaign accomplished exactly what it set out to do, which was to bring the concept of UBI out from the fringes of American political discourse and into the mainstream. And it's a good thing Yang's UBI-driven message struck a chord when it did, because, as he often noted on the campaign trail, automation and the destructive societal consequences that come with it aren't some hypothetical problems for future generations to tackle. The displacement of vast chunks of the American workforce is happening as we speak, and has been happening for decades. In the 1970s, manufacturing accounted for nearly 30% of American jobs. Now, that same manufacturing sector makes up just 10% of the workforce. What became of the millions of well-paying factory and assembly line jobs lost during that time, you ask? Replaced, and mostly by low-paying service industry jobs that come with little to no benefits. Of course, some people, and rightfully so, will point out that automation wasn't the sole culprit responsible for America's decades-long manufacturing decline. Outsourcing to cheap foreign labour also played a key role, but not as much as you might think. For some perspective, from 2000 to 2010 alone, America lost 5.6 million manufacturing jobs. Of those lost jobs, the vast majority, 85% in fact, were due to automation, not outsourcing. And, unfortunately, the years ahead look even bleaker. At this very second, a quarter of all American jobs are labelled at high risk of automation. Another 36% are marked at medium risk. In the coming decade alone, self-driving cars have the potential to displace some 3.5 million truck driving jobs, the most common profession in 29 states, and millions more Uber, Lyft, and taxi drivers. According to the McKinsey Global Institute, 73 million jobs in the US could be automated away by 2030. Another 800 million worldwide. When you look at the threat posed by automation from that unsettling perspective, UBI suddenly starts to look a whole lot more like a common-sense, forward-thinking solution to a problem with potentially dystopian consequences. Not some wacky idea out of left field, or some albeit interesting idea that's simply too far ahead of its time. Not at all. Andrew Yang's push for UBI came at exactly the right time. At a time when Americans are struggling more than ever, and at a time when a worldwide pandemic has threatened to wipe out what little financial security most Americans have left. Looking back in hindsight, we must come to grips with the fact that much of the US's post-World War II economic prosperity was built on the back of a booming manufacturing industry, one aided by innovations in machinery that radically boosted productivity. That, combined with things like high progressive taxation, strong unions, high wages, and large investments in infrastructure, led to what economists and historians now call the golden age of economic expansion in America. A period that, ignoring the obvious racist and sexist factors that also existed, birthed the idea of the American dream and saw millions of struggling Americans thrust into the middle class. A time when one wage earner alone could support an entire household by his or herself. But those same technological advancements that drove the post-war boom progressed to a point where they weren't just aiding workers anymore, but replacing them wholesale. Millions of well-paid, benefit-rich manufacturing jobs became obsolete, replaced with more productive and less costly machines. Once you mix that in with the inevitable appeal of outsourcing jobs to cheap overseas labour, enabled by countless corporate-friendly and exploitative trade deals, you're left with a recipe for economic disaster, and a whole bunch of societal ills to go along with it. In just the span of a few decades, America's once strong manufacturing economy, which elevated so many into the middle class, transformed into a service and gig economy, where most Americans work crappy jobs for little pay and almost no benefits whatsoever. A reality that, unfortunately, got even worse following the 2008 financial crisis. During the so-called recovery, somehow even more financially stable jobs were automated away or outsourced. In the years following the 2008 economic collapse, the top 1% raked in over 91% of all new income gains, while the rest of Americans were lucky if they ever made it back to their pre-recession financial levels. What we're left with now is wealth inequality levels that rival the Great Depression, an ever-shrinking middle class that once acted as a stabilizing force for American society, an owner class reaping record levels of productivity and profits on the backs of machines, AI, and robots, and a debt-ridden working class toiling away at dead-end jobs that barely put enough food on the table. It doesn't take a genius to predict what a society with conditions like those will foster over time. Authoritarianism, unrest, division, alienation, violence, despair, and institutional mistrust. All things that, unfortunately, today's America has in spades. Need proof? Just look at the deadly opioid crisis, the near-constant mass shootings and gun violence, the epidemic of mental illness and suicide, the first decline in life expectancy since World War I, the resurgence of racial animosity and xenophobia, the increased partisanship and tribalism, the protests, rioting and looting, the record levels of distrust in both government and each other. Or, I don't know, the fact that an authoritarian reality TV star rose to the office of presidency. Whether we like it or not, the social fabric of America is fraying at the seams, and we can either do nothing about it and bear the consequences, or, as Yang argued, we can implement some form of universal basic income that fairly redistributes the wealth created by massively productive machines so that everyone benefits, not just a few at the top. Of course, though, whenever UBI is brought up, you're likely to hear one argument trotted out against it over and over and over again. It goes something like this. People will work less, and that's a bad thing. But that deeply ingrained mindset, which sociologist Max Weber traced back to the origins of Protestantism, relies on the assumption that meaning and purpose are only found in, or are primarily found in, one's employment. Without work, the argument goes, humans would be destined to become listless, aimless individuals, drifting through life with no meaning and no purpose. Work in itself became an inherently virtuous endeavour that should be celebrated, no matter the occupation or the level of life satisfaction that it brings with it. Of course, there is some truth to the argument. Some work does indeed bring a sense of happiness and fulfilment to people's lives, and studies regularly show that the jobless report being much less happy than those who hold stable jobs. That's undeniable. But if you dig a bit deeper into the work equals fulfillment argument, it quickly falls apart as a far too simplistic view of the relationship between work and meaning. Because, let's be honest, people don't usually find meaning stuck inside a cubicle for 8 hours a day. They don't typically find purpose working a job they feel no stake in or agency over. And they almost certainly don't find life satisfaction performing menial, repetitive tasks that could just as easily be done by a robot. We have to state the obvious. Meaning and purpose can be found in work, yes, but are by no means inherent to it. Nor does work have a monopoly on those two intangibles to a happy life. Raising a family, finding love, pursuing a passion, travelling the world, selflessly helping others, spending time with loved ones, or engaging in many of life's other profound endeavours are just as much or more capable of bringing meaning to our lives. And unfortunately, rather than bringing a sense of purpose to people, many of today's jobs have the exact opposite effect, making us feel lost, undervalued, unnecessary, taken advantage of, and powerless. Which is why it's no surprise that so many workers in America feel overly stressed out, overworked, and unhappy at their jobs. The sooner we can admit that work isn't the end-all be-all to a satisfied life, the sooner we can have a more rounded and nuanced understanding of how work relates to happiness. And once we accomplish that, we can finally take steps towards restructuring society around the uncomfortable fact that a large portion of Americans work low-paying, mind-numbing, and generally unsatisfying jobs. Jobs that, up until recently, we all largely took for granted. These low-level workers form the backbone of our economy, and it honestly shouldn't take a full-on worldwide pandemic for us to realise their inherent value, and for us to realise that, without them, we would all be screwed. Which is why the least we could do as a society is to empower them with the financial means to find purpose and meaning outside of their oftentimes dull and unfulfilling work lives, instead of loudly and meaninglessly singing their praises again the next time another COVID-19-like event occurs. We also must admit that the US is little more than a nation of debtors at this point. Student loan debt sits at a record $1.6 trillion. Credit card debt is at an all-time high of nearly $1 trillion. Auto loans are at $1.2 trillion. 137 million Americans are struggling with medical debt. The average personal debt each American owes, excluding mortgages, is $38,000. When you factor in mortgages, that number skyrockets to $182,421. In total, Americans now owe more than $14 trillion in debt. This overbearing, debt-laden reality comes at a time when over 3/4 of Americans already live paycheck to paycheck, at a time when a majority of Americans don't have enough money in the bank to cover a $500 emergency, and at a time when routine expenses like doctor visits, food and housing have skyrocketed over the past 2 decades. We have to ask ourselves, is this really what a healthy economy looks like? Do we really think that this extreme amount of debt is sustainable in a consumer economy like our own? Of course, the answer to those 2 questions are so obvious they don't need to be said. People burdened by that kind of astronomical debt aren't going to go out shopping like they did before. They aren't going to buy a new car or take their family on a holiday, and they most definitely aren't going to start a small business that could boost their local community. Chances are they will continue to do what they do every day. Work long hours, trying in vain to pay off the endlessly accumulating piles of debt bogging them down. This is especially true for millennials, who were told time and again growing up that going to college was the surefire route to a secure future. Despite doing exactly what they were told, though, many are now left drowning in student debt, underemployed, and struggling to make ends meet in the low-paid gig economy. Shockingly, millennials own just 3% of America's total household wealth. Boomers, on the other hand, own 57%, while Gen X owns 16%. Here's how Umair Haq sums up the financial plight millennials are dealing with, and that Gen Z will surely also soon face. Millennials are America's first truly poor generation. Haq writes, they don't have money, they don't have opportunities, they don't have safety nets, they don't have cushions, they don't have mobility. They have to rely on their parents, if they're lucky, and maybe live at home well into their middle age. They can't afford things like healthcare, education, housing, and bills. They simply don't earn enough money, never have and never will. They can't even afford to have basic relationships and marriages and partnerships anymore, one of the truest signs of real poverty. What they do have is debt, decline, stagnation, and despair. They are like the Soviet Union's last generation in a sense, only the mirror image. American collapse's first truly poor generation, the first generation to have to live in a formerly wealthy country, which now has an imploded middle class. No functioning social systems, predatory institutions, failed elites, and a broken dream. I think we can all agree that there are very few things in the world as stress-inducing and demoralizing as grinding day to day at a job, only to see a large chunk of those hard-earned wages siphoned away to pay down debts. I think we can also agree that there are very few things in the world as suffocating and totalitarian in nature as a lack of money. It literally paralyzes people from doing the things they want and love, and forces them to be unquestioning cogs in the machine, without the autonomy to chase their dreams or the ability to alter their life paths in search of something better. But most menacing of all about the enormous amount of debt and lack of financial security most Americans deal with is the constant fear it hangs over their heads that one day they might wake up and have nothing at all. It's utterly damning, and it keeps millions of Americans from flourishing and finding happiness in life. That constant fear, and the anxiety that comes with it, is without a doubt one of the major reasons why America sits at just 18th in the world happiness rankings, despite having the world's largest economy. And odds are it probably plays a massive role in our country's abnormally high stress levels and widespread mental health problems, both of which have gone from unimaginably bad to thrown into hyperdrive since the pandemic began. According to the CDC data, in the first few months following the outbreak, 40% of Americans reported dealing with one or more mental health problems. 13% said they had started or increased substance abuse. And over 10% said they had contemplated suicide in the past 30 days. For essential workers, those numbers jumped to a staggering 54% for mental health difficulties, 25% for substance abuse, and 22% for contemplating suicide. And for people aged 18 to 24, the numbers were somehow even worse. 75% had mental health issues, 25% were abusing substances, and 26% had thought about suicide. Quite obviously, that's not what a happy and healthy society looks like. Just take a moment and imagine for a second the peace of mind we would all have, knowing no matter what happened, we'd all have $1,000, as Andrew Yang proposed, arriving in the mail each month. Things like getting laid off, having to take an ambulance to the emergency room, or needing a costly car repair would still suck, sure, but would no longer be huge, potentially life-shattering obstacles to overcome. Paying bills each month would no longer be a dreaded prospect. Debts would finally start being paid off rather than added to, and people would finally be able to become positive contributors to the economy again, able to buy things other than the bare necessities, able to save money for a rainy day, and able to afford essential things like groceries, daycare, and regular medical or dental visits. Not to mention, with a monthly UBI as a fallback option, workers would finally have the freedom to refuse anything less than dignified labour conditions and comfortable living wages, a huge need in an era where labour unions have been utterly decimated, leaving employees powerless and forced to accept poor wages in exchange for month-to-month survival. But even more importantly, imagine finally living in a country where nearly everyone has the extra cash to do the things that bring them joy and happiness in life, without having to constantly worry about a number at the bottom of their bank account. Things like taking vacation, going to nice dinners, taking up new hobbies, or simply basking in more leisure time would finally become part of our life routines, not just once-in-a-while luxuries. UBI is by no means the only solution to the staggering lack of financial security most Americans deal with on a daily basis, but it is by far the most obvious and straightforward. Does a monthly universal income run the risk that some small amount of people might exit the economy and live life as unemployed paupers? Sure, it's possible. But so far, the vast majority of universal basic income studies suggest otherwise. The most robust UBI study to date, conducted in Finland, saw 2,000 people given the equivalent of $650 a month for 2 years straight, no strings attached. Despite what UBI opponents claimed would happen, the free government money did not make the people any lazier, but it did, however, drastically boost their financial security and mental well-being, a finding since backed up by numerous other studies. Research into the unconditional dividend payments given to Alaskan residents each year found that universal and permanent cash transfers do not significantly decrease aggregate employment. And a recently concluded UBI study in Stockton, California, one of the most hollowed-out towns in America, found that people receiving $500 of free money per month there actually worked more, not less. And, on top of that, the overwhelming majority of the UBI money they received was spent on necessities, like housing and food, not luxuries or vices. But just as a hypothetical for a moment, let's consider that universal basic income would cause a significant rise in laziness among people. So what? The negative consequences of a handful of people taking their monthly guaranteed income payments and working less or not working at all pales in comparison to the tremendous amount of good UBI would do on day one, just by alleviating poverty, not to mention all the other massive benefits we'd get from it. It's a trade-off we should all be willing to accept. Here's how philosopher Bertrand Russell described a world where people could work less and enjoy more leisure time thanks to automation and UBI. Above all, there will be happiness and joy in life, instead of frayed nerves, weariness and dyspepsia. The work exacted will be enough to make leisure delightful, but not enough to produce exhaustion. Since men will not be tired in their spare time, they will not demand only such amusements as are passive and vapid. At least 1% will probably devote the time not spent in professional work to pursuits of some public importance. And since they will not depend upon these pursuits for their livelihood, their originality will be unhampered, and there will be no need to conform to the standards set by elderly pundits. But it is not in these exceptional cases that the advantages of leisure will appear. Ordinary men and women, having the opportunity of a happy life, will become more kindly and less persecuting, and less inclined to view others with suspicion. Good nature is, of all moral qualities, the one that the world needs most, and good nature is the result of ease and security, not of a life of arduous struggle. Modern methods of production have given us the possibility of ease and security for all. We have chosen instead to have overwork for some and starvation for others. Hitherto, we have continued to be as energetic as we were before there were machines. In this, we have been foolish. But there is no reason to go on being foolish forever. At the end of the day, there's a lot of fear surrounding automation, and that's completely understandable. Automation is altering society as we know it, and won't be slowing down any time soon. Jobs will continue to be taken, livelihoods uprooted, and that's a scary thought, especially in a country where both sides of the political aisle have long romanticized work for work's sake. But automation doesn't have to be viewed as a problem. Instead, it should be viewed as an opportunity. An opportunity to free us from dangerous, boring and repetitive work. An opportunity to let machines, robots and AI do many of our jobs better than we ever could. And an opportunity to continue radically increasing production, with the end goal of providing mass abundance to all people everywhere in the world. The major challenge lies in not allowing that abundance to get funneled to a few at the top, while the rest of us fight over what few scraps remain, which is precisely why we need universal basic income, and we need it right now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more, please like and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon.